He sold her on a Tuesday morning, the same way he might have sold a car he no longer needed. Bernard Mercer sat across from Adrian Voss in a mahogany-paneled office that cigar smoke and old money, and he signed his daughter's name on a contract without once asking what she wanted. His hand didn't shake. He didn't pause. He didn't look up. He simply pressed the pen to the paper with the efficiency of a man settling a bill. And just like that, Eveline Mercer's future was transferred from one set of hands to another. She was 26 years old. She had a degree in art history she'd never used, a small apartment with a broken radiator, and a father who'd just gambled away everything, including her. If you were in her shoes that morning, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Because the stories on this channel don't slow down for anyone. Every week, we bring you tales that will keep you up at night. Betrayal, survival, power, and the kind of love that nobody planned for. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. Cathedral had been built in 1887 by a shipping magnate who believed that beauty and fear could share the same roof. He wasn't wrong. 300 candles lined the stone window ledges. String quartet played Strauss in the corner, not because anyone had requested it, but because the wedding planner understood the aesthetic Adrian Voss demanded. 500 guests moved through the space in their finest clothes, trailing perfume and whispered politics, and every single one of them understood, on some animal level, that the celebration around them existed inside a system of rules they could not afford to break. Eveline stood at the altar in a dress that wasn't hers. It had been purchased by Adrian's assistant 3 days earlier, ivory silk, structured bodice, cathedral-length veil, and delivered to her apartment in a white box without a note. She'd tried it on alone, standing in front of her bathroom mirror in that small, drafty apartment, and she had not cried. She'd decided very deliberately not to cry. Crying meant accepting that this was happening to her. Eveline wasn't ready to accept that yet, but it happened anyway. The ceremony took 40 minutes. The priest spoke. Adrian stood beside her in a dark suit that fit him like architecture, broad-shouldered and still, and when the moment came for the vows, he turned and looked at her with gray eyes that revealed nothing. His voice was even and controlled when he said the words. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected, which surprised her because her hands were cold and her pulse was doing something complicated inside her wrists. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly against her cheek. Not her mouth, her cheek. A message in that too. Everything with Adrian Voss was a message. The reception consumed the cathedral's main hall. Tables draped in white linen. Towers of flowers, champagne arriving in relays before guests could finish their glasses. Eveline moved through it all in a kind of compressed shock, shaking hands with people whose names she immediately forgot, smiling at women who studied her dress, and then studied her face, and then decided she was either very brave or very stupid. Her father was somewhere in the room. She could feel him the way you feel a draft, a persistent, low-grade discomfort you learn to ignore. She'd seen him briefly during the ceremony, seated in the third row in a suit that someone else had clearly pressed, looking pale and relieved in the way that only a man who has just escaped a death sentence can look relieved. Caught her eye once. She looked away first. Some things you file away to feel later. Some things you can't afford to feel at all. Adrian materialized at her side with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime moving through rooms without announcing himself. He pressed a glass of champagne into her hand. "How are you holding up?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm fine." She sipped the champagne. "Your guests are very interested in me. You're the only person here they don't already know." He scanned the room over her head with those flat gray eyes, cataloging exits and faces and dynamics with what appeared to be no effort at all. "That makes you interesting." "Interesting like a curiosity," she said, or interesting like a threat. He looked down at her. Something moved behind his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "That depends entirely on you." She didn't answer. Across the room, she spotted an older man, seated alone at a corner table. eating his dinner with the unhurried calm of someone who had never once been made to wait for anything. White-haired, broad-featured, with the deeply lined face of a man who had survived, long enough to watch everyone around him deteriorate. He was watching her with frank, unguarded attention. "Who is that?" she said. Adrian followed her gaze. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. August Rourke. The name landed with quiet weight. Even Eveline, who had grown up entirely outside this world, had heard it spoken in the careful, lowered voice way that people reserved for things they considered genuinely dangerous. "He's watching me," she said. "He watches everything." Adrian steered her gently away from Rourke's sightline with a hand at the small of her back, his first real physical contact with her since the ceremony. "Don't engage with him tonight. If he approaches you, be polite and find me immediately." Why? Because Rourke doesn't make small talk. The string quartet shifted into something slower. The dance floor opened. Adrian offered her his hand with the formal precision of a man fulfilling an obligation. And Eveline took it, and they moved together into the open space at the center of the hall. He was a better dancer than she expected. She wasn't sure why that surprised her. She supposed she'd imagined someone like Adrian Voss to be competent at everything that was the nature of men who had built empires out of fear and calculation. But there was something unsettling about the way he moved with her. Easy, unhurried, as though he'd done this 10,000 times, and the particular partner was irrelevant. Maybe she was irrelevant. Maybe that was the whole point. She focused on the mechanics of the dance and told herself to breathe normally, and it was during that deliberate, controlled breath that she saw it. A red dot, small, moving. It traced a slow path across the stained glass above the eastern window, traveling downward with the unhurried precision of something mechanical, something aimed. Eveline tracked it without moving her head. Dancers around them. The quartet, playing, 500 people drinking champagne and watching the newlyweds, and a red laser sight dropping in, measured increments toward the back of the room, toward Adrian's chest. Her body processed the information before her mind finished catching up. She did not freeze. She did not scream. She pulled Adrian closer in what must have looked, to the watching guests, like a sudden romantic impulse, a new wife, drawing her husband into an intimate hold, and she pressed her mouth against the side of his jaw and whispered, very quietly, "Don't react. There's a laser on you." From the east window. "We need the pillar." She felt him go absolutely still. Not the stillness of fear. The stillness of a man who has just received information and is processing it with the kind of rapid, cold precision that only people who have survived violence can access. "How certain," he murmured against her hair. "The dot was moving toward your chest. Gone now because I moved us. How certain do you need me to be?" 1 second. 2. Then Adrian shifted his weight, as though following her lead in the dance, turning them slowly, naturally, guiding her steps with just enough pressure to redirect their path. To anyone watching, it looked like a private moment, the groom leading his bride toward the edge of the floor. The bullet came through the east window 3 seconds later. The sound was wrong, a sharp, cracking impact against the stone pillar where Adrian's back would have been, followed by a beat of silence, and then the screaming started as glass rained across the nearest table, and guests lurched backward in a cascade of toppled chairs and spilled champagne. Adrian had already pulled her behind the pillar. His hand was on her arm, not protective exactly, more like the grip of a man who suddenly can't afford to let go of a critical piece of equipment. His security moved through the room in the same moment, efficient and fast, channeling guests away from the windows, and Eveline pressed her back against the cold stone and felt her heart going at something close to 200 beats a minute. "You're all right," Adrian said. "I know," she said. He looked at her, really looked at her, with those gray eyes that gave nothing away normally. See him doing it again, recalculating, reassessing, rearranging her in whatever mental filing system he kept for the people around him. She wasn't sure whether that felt better or worse than being filed under irrelevant. His head of security, a thick-necked man named Carver, appeared at his elbow. "Shooter is gone." Single shot from the east gallery, sweeping the building. "Quietly," Adrian said. "I want the reception to continue." Carver looked at him. "Sir," I said, "continue." Adrian straightened his jacket. He looked at Eveline. Can you walk? I was never not able to walk. Something in his face shifted. If it was the beginning of something like respect, it was the barest possible hint of it, the way a winter sky lightens 2 minutes before sunrise, barely visible, easy to miss. Took her hand and led her back onto the dance floor. The guests, who had been pressed toward the far walls, hesitantly returned. Quartet, after a moment of consultative whispering, began to play again. And Eveline Mercer, who that morning had been a bankrupt man's bargaining chip, finished her first dance with Adrian Voss beneath a shattered window, in a room full of people pretending not to be afraid, while security combed the building for a man who had just tried to kill her husband. She smiled when the music required it. She didn't shake. Later, she would be surprised by that. The dance ended. Guests applauded with the particular enthusiasm of people who have just survived something and want to prove they're not rattled. Adrian guided her to the edge of the floor, exchanged a few clipped words with Carver, and then told her, without looking at her, to go to the ladies' lounge and stay there until he sent someone for her. No, she said. He turned slowly. Excuse me, I said no. Her voice was steady. She was mildly astonished by that. Someone in this room ordered that shot. Your own security didn't see the laser I did. Which means whoever you're going to consult with right now might be the person who planned this. I'm not going to the lounge to sit and wait while you figure that out. The silence between them lasted long enough that two passing guests noticed it and moved quickly away. Then stay close, Adrian said. Don't speak unless I speak to you first. And if I tell you to move, you move. She nodded. She didn't mention that she'd already started watching the room. The technique wasn't anything she'd been taught. It was something she developed over years of moving through difficult social situations, gallery openings, her father's increasingly desperate dinner parties, the particular minefield of a room full of people who all know something you don't. You learn to read the gap between what a face is doing and what a body is doing. Face will perform. The body almost never lies. Silas Marr stood near the bar with a glass of scotch he'd been holding for 30 minutes without drinking. He was Adrian's dock lieutenant. Eveline had been quietly briefed on key names by an assistant earlier in the week. In the way a new employee gets introduced to org charts. Marr was talking to two other men and laughing at appropriate moments, but his eyes kept moving to Adrian with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not fear, not relief, something more like frustration. The expression of a man whose plan has been complicated. August Rourke was still at his corner table, finishing his dessert. He hadn't moved during the commotion. Hadn't even, from what she could see, looked up from his plate. That level of composure, in the immediate aftermath of a shooting, meant either that he'd known it was coming and trusted it would fail, or that he was so far above the situation that it genuinely didn't concern him. Couldn't read him yet. He was too controlled. She set him aside. Then she found Dante Belluro. She knew him from the briefing Southern docks. Ambitious, mid-40s, favored expensive ties, and held territorial grudges. He was standing near the windows on the opposite end of the hall from the broken one, talking to a small group with a wide smile and animated hands, laughing. At a wedding where someone had just taken a shot at the groom, Dante Belluro was standing near the windows and laughing. Eveline watched his hands. They were wrapped around a crystal champagne flute with the careful white-knuckled grip of someone trying very hard to project looseness. And his feet, she'd read once in a book about behavioral analysis she'd picked up at a table in college, and never quite forgotten that the feet were the last part of the body to learn social lying. People controlled their faces. They controlled their hands. Almost nobody thought to control their feet. Dante's feet were angled toward the exit. She looked at the woman beside him. His wife, Marcella Bellaro, was a few years younger, dark-haired, wearing a red dress that had probably cost more than Eveline's monthly rent had been. Marcella was smiling at the right moments, holding her champagne correctly. Her free hand, the one not holding the glass, was tucked into the strap of her small evening bag, not loosely, not casually, but with the clenched, habitual grip of someone who has something valuable inside and has been thinking about it all night. Adrian was in a low conversation with Carver, 6 feet away. Eveline moved to his side and waited for a pause. "Bellaro," she said quietly. Adrian glanced at her. What about him? Watch his wife's bag. Feet. She didn't elaborate. Adrian looked. She watched him process it, the slight shift in how he was holding himself. What are you seeing? He said. Not to her, more to himself. Someone who knew the shot was coming and is now waiting to find out whether the fallback plan works. That's a significant accusation. You asked me to stay close. He was quiet for a moment. Across the Felimsenso, Marcella Bellaro excused herself from the group with a smile and moved toward the interior corridor that led to the private suites. The ladies' lounge, Adrian said carefully. I know. Eveline handed him her champagne glass. Tell Carver not to follow me. Adrian held her champagne glass and said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, if she has a weapon, then I'll manage. Eveline. She was already moving. The corridor was dim after the brightness of the main hall. Old stone walls, iron sconces, the distant sound of the quartet muffled and softened by distance. Eveline kept her footsteps even, and her pace unhurried, just a woman going to freshen up, nothing remarkable. And she tracked Marcella's red dress through the archway ahead. The ladies' lounge was a converted antechamber, velvet chairs, gilded mirrors, the particular hushed atmosphere of old wealth. 2 other women were inside when Eveline entered. She moved to the mirror and opened her small bag and began doing nothing meaningful with its contents, watching Marcella's reflection. Marcella was at the far end of the room, standing near the ornate window that overlooked the courtyard. She had her phone out. She was typing quickly, or reading. Her posture was too rigid for casual browsing, too tense. The other 2 women finished and left, their conversation fading into the corridor. Eveline and Marcella were alone. The silence held for 5 seconds. Then Marcella's fingers stopped moving. She hadn't heard anything. She'd felt the quality of the room change the way people do when they know they're being watched. She turned. For a moment, both women simply looked at each other. The wife of the dock lieutenant and the brand new wife of the man someone had just tried to kill. Something passed between them, in that look, a mutual recognition that the social performance was over. I was just leaving, Marcella said. Her voice was smooth, careful, the practiced voice of a woman who had spent years in rooms where saying the wrong word had consequences. Your husband's feet were pointing toward the exit the whole time the shot was fired, Eveline said. Color drained from Marcella's face. And there it was, the flinch, the involuntary physical response that confirmed the accusation before a single word was spoken. Marcella had not, in that moment, asked what Eveline was talking about. She had not performed confusion. She had reacted the way you react when someone says the true thing out loud. I don't know what you're. How long has the loading bay exit been part of the plan? Eveline's voice remained conversational. She was very conscious of the distance between herself and the door. Was the sedan already there before the ceremony? Or did someone park it after we went in? Marcella stopped. You're not what Dante said you were. What did Dante say I was? A placeholder. Someone's frightened daughter who wouldn't know to look twice at anything. The contempt in Marcella's voice was genuine, not performed, not calculated. Real disdain. That was interesting. It meant Dante had genuinely believed it. The plan had been constructed around the assumption that Eveline was decorative. He was almost right, Eveline said. Almost. He forgot to consider that frightened daughters learn very quickly to read a room. Marcella's hand moved. It wasn't a lunge, she was too controlled for that. But her fingers found the clasp of that evening bag with the muscle memory of someone who had practiced the motion. Eveline was already moving when the bag opened. Putting herself sideways, using the back of the nearest velvet chair as a pivot, and when Marcella brought the compact pistol up, Eveline drove the chair hard into Marcella's side with everything she had. Pistol discharged into the ceiling. Plaster dust. The shocking flatness of the report in an enclosed stone room. Eveline's ears rang. She grabbed for Marcella's wrist with both hands. As they went sideways together, crashed into the gilded mirror, which cracked but didn't shatter, and ended up in an ugly, ungraceful tangle of silk and desperation on the velvet floor. Marcella was stronger than she looked and angrier than she'd seemed. She got a hand free and drove an elbow into Eveline's ribs with real force. And the pain was bright and specific and absolutely nothing like anything Eveline had encountered in her previous life of gallery openings and quiet apartments with broken radiators. She held on. She held on because the alternative was to let go, and letting go meant the gun came back up. The heavy brass lamp from the side table was within reach. Eveline got her hand around its base awkward angle, wrong grip, and brought it across in a short arc that connected with the side of Marcella's head with a dense, terrible sound. Marcella went slack. Eveline sat on the velvet floor of the ladies' lounge and breathed. Her ribs hurt. Her hands were shaking. Finally, the shaking she'd been holding back all night arrived with interest. She sat with it for 10 seconds, breathing through the discomfort, letting her pulse descend from wherever it had gone. Then she reached over and picked up Marcella's phone. The screen was still active. The message thread was open, the last sent message visible at the top of the stack, time-stamped 9 minutes ago. He made it. She got him out of range. Fall back to the loading bay. Sedan ready. Don't wait past midnight. Eveline read it twice. Then she stood up, straightened her wedding dress, checked her reflection in the cracked mirror. She looked like someone who had recently been in a fight, which was accurate, and walked out of the ladies' lounge with Marcella's phone in her hand. Adrian was in the corridor, not because he'd sent Carver. He was there himself, and there was something in the way he was standing taut, displaced from his usual composed stillness that told her he'd heard the shot and had decided not to wait. He looked at her, at the phone in her hand, at the state of her dress. Marcella Bellaro is unconscious in the ladies' lounge, Eveline said. She had a gun. The shot that hit the ceiling was hers, not the sniper's. She held out the phone. Dante is at the loading bay. This is his exit plan. Adrian took the phone. He read the message. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did a deep, internal shift, the sound of a lock moving. He looked at her for a long moment. You could have waited for Carver, he said. She was going to leave. You could have been shot. Could have, she agreed. I wasn't. Another long look. Then Adrian pocketed the phone, pulled out his own, and sent a single text to Carver that Eveline didn't see. Stay next to me, he said. Not 3 steps behind. Next to me. It was the first time he had offered her that position. She fell in beside him, and they walked together toward the loading bay, through stone corridors that smelled of cold and candle smoke, past oil portraits of men who had owned and controlled and lost, down a narrow stairwell, lit by a single bare bulb, and Eveline's wedding dress dragged across concrete floors in the dark while her husband moved beside her, with the focused quiet of a man who was about to end something. The loading bay door was heavy, iron, and it opened onto a wide concrete area behind the cathedral where delivery trucks parked during events. The night outside was cold and clear. A black sedan idled near the far wall, its exhaust curling in the dark air, and Dante Bellaro stood beside it in his expensive suit with his expensive tie, speaking in a low voice to the driver, not yet aware the door had opened. Adrian walked out first. Eveline followed. Dante turned when he heard the footsteps. His face cycled through 3 expressions in about 1 second relief at the familiar silhouette. Confusion at what he was seeing, and then, beneath the confusion, something that might have been the beginning of a calculation was about whether this situation was survivable. He settled on a performance. His face opened into something that was almost a smile. Adrian. He spread his hand slightly, the universal gesture of openness, of nothing to hide. I was its chaos in there. I just needed some air. Dante. Adrian's voice was conversational, completely flat. Marcella is in the ladies' lounge. Dante's eyes moved to Eveline. She held his gaze. She did not smile. Is she all right? Dante said. She's alive, Adrian said. The phone she was using to coordinate your exit is in my pocket. He stopped walking. He was 10 feet from Dante. The sedan's engine idled. Tell me about the southern docks. The performance dropped. Didn't collapse all at once, it fell away in pieces. The smile first, then the open hands, then the practiced looseness of his posture. What was left was something rawer and harder and genuinely afraid. Listen, Dante said, listen. This wasn't. The original plan wasn't. He stopped, reassembled. Rourke approached me 6 months ago. He told me you were losing grip on the Eastern Territory, that the whole thing was going to fracture, and that the smart play was to— Don't, Adrian said. The word was not loud. It was the flattest sound Eveline had heard all night. Dante stopped. Don't make August Rourke responsible for your decision. Adrian's voice remained at the same low, even pitch. I know what Rourke wants. I've known for 2 years. What I didn't know was which of my people he'd found who wanted the southern docks enough to trade a bullet for them. He tilted his head. Now I know. Dante's jaw worked. He was doing math, she could see it. The rapid, desperate calculation of a man checking every angle for an exit and finding all of them closed. His hand moved toward his jacket. The driver reached for his own weapon in the same moment. What happened next was fast and very ugly, and not anything like the choreographed violence of movies. Adrian moved. Carver appeared from somewhere. Eveline hadn't seen where he'd positioned himself, but he was there, and the driver's reaching arm was controlled, and then controlled more firmly, and the sound that followed was not a gunshot, but something worse, something anatomical. Dante's hand came away from his jacket empty. His face had gone the particular gray of a man who has just watched an option disappear. The docks, Adrian said. He hadn't moved much. He wasn't breathing hard. Everything that's moved through them for the past 18 months. I want the accounting. Tonight. Adrian, you wanted what I built. So tell me exactly what you did with it. What Dante said then, in the cold loading bay behind the cathedral, with his driver immobilized, and his wife unconscious in a velvet room upstairs, and his phone burning in Eveline's memory, was a long and detailed and clearly rehearsed accounting of exactly how much money he had moved out of the southern port operations and into his own accounts over a period of 14 months, and where that money had gone, and who else had known. Nobody else had known. It was Dante and Marcella and the sniper, who was a freelance contractor and already gone. When he finished, the loading bay was very quiet. Dante looked at Adrian. Then he looked at Eveline, really looked, in the way he clearly hadn't bothered to look before, and she could see him understanding now, too late, that he had constructed his plan around a version of her that didn't exist. What happens now? Dante said. Adrian's answer was brief and final, and Eveline did not look away. The sedan's engine had stopped running at some point. The loading bay was very cold. Somewhere above them, through the stone floor, the string quartet was playing something slow and formal, and 500 people were drinking champagne and pretending the evening had been nearly perfect. Eveline stood in the dark loading bay in her ivory silk wedding dress, and her cracked plaster hair and her bruised ribs, and she did not shake, and she did not look away. She understood with the specific clarity of a moment that cannot be unmade that she had stepped across a threshold tonight that existed in only one direction. There was no walking back through it. When they returned to the reception hall, Carver moved ahead of them to open the service door, and the warmth and noise of the party folded around them like nothing had happened. Because, as far as 500 guests knew, nothing had. The broken window had been quietly boarded over. The glass swept away. The bride and groom had simply stepped away briefly, a private moment, understandable newlyweds, and now they were back. The wedding planner materialized with the anxious efficiency of someone whose professional reputation was contingent on everything appearing flawless. Cake, she said, with the hushed urgency of someone reporting a military objective. We should do the cake now, while the energy is still. Fine, Adrian said. The cake was 6 tiers, white fondant, minimalist and expensive. It arrived on a rolling cart to modest fanfare. The photographer appeared. The guests gathered. Someone handed Adrian the ceremonial knife. He held it for a moment. Then he turned and placed it in Eveline's hand. Not beside her hand. Not a gesture of sharing. He placed the handle directly into her palm, and he closed her fingers around it with his own, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that had been recalculating her all night. You hold the blade, he said quietly, beneath the crowd noise. I hold your hand. She looked at the knife, at her hand around the handle, at the bruise already forming on her forearm, where Marcella's elbow had connected. She looked up at him. Together, he said. She pressed the blade into the white fondant, and the camera flashed, and the room erupted in applause. And Eveline Mercer, who had been traded for a debt, who had been dismissed as a placeholder, who had been underestimated by every person in this room, smiled for the photograph with the specific smile of someone who has just learned something essential about who they actually are. Not the smile of a woman who survived. The smile of a woman who decided to. The applause was still fading when Adrian's phone buzzed against his palm. He didn't look at it immediately. He kept his expression neutral, kept his posture open, kept performing the role of a groom at his own wedding reception, with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing roles his entire adult life. Eveline felt the shift in him, though not through anything visible, but through the small, involuntary tightening of the hand that still covered hers on the cake knife. Pressure change, like weather. She set the knife down on the table and picked up her champagne and waited. He read the message. Then he put the phone away and smiled at the nearest cluster of guests and said something pleasant about the cake that she didn't absorb, and the cluster laughed, and the photographer moved on, and Adrian leaned toward her with the casual intimacy of a man speaking to his wife and said, very quietly, against her ear, "Rourke wants a meeting. Tonight." He couldn't wait until tomorrow? With August Rourke, tonight means he's already decided something. Tomorrow would be a courtesy. He straightened. His smile remained in place like a fixture. He wants 20 minutes. Private room. Are you going? I don't have the luxury of refusing. He finally looked at her directly, and something in his expression was different from the way he'd been looking at her all evening. Still guarded, she didn't think Adrian Voss was capable of anything else but differently guarded, as if what he was protecting had quietly rearranged itself. I need you to stay visible. Move through the room. Talk to people. Make it look like I stepped away for something minor. What counts as minor at your own wedding? Nothing. Everything. That's the point. He touched her elbow briefly, a small, functional gesture that nonetheless felt like more than it was. Can you do that? I've been doing it all night, she said. He held her gaze for one more second, then held her gaze for when to the crowd, with unhurried ease, and Eveline turned toward the room and began the particular performance of a woman who has nothing on her mind. It was not a small performance. The room was watching her not openly, not rudely, but with the careful peripheral attention of people who understand that the most important information is usually found what principals are doing when they think no one is looking. She moved through it with a champagne glass she didn't drink from and a smile she distributed it equally. And she talked to a woman in a blue gown about a holiday in Portugal that Eveline had never taken. And she laughed at an anecdote from a red-faced man in a banker's suit that she didn't follow. And she was very, very aware of Silas Marr standing near the east windows, the boarded-over east windows, where the bullet had come through. Marr was watching her. Not the way the other guests watched her, the curious, assessing peripheral watching of people processing a newcomer. Marr was watching her the way you watch something that has suddenly become a problem. Direct. Calculating. He had a glass of scotch in his hand that she was certain was still the same glass from earlier in the evening, still mostly full, because Silas Marr was not a man who drank when he needed to think. She made sure not to look at him for more than 2 seconds at a time. Long enough to register, not long enough to engage. Across the room, she noticed one of Adrian's security team, not Carver. A younger one, she didn't know the name of, positioned himself 2 steps closer to Marr than he'd been 10 minutes ago. So Adrian had noticed too, or Carver had. Someone had. She filed it away and kept moving. The private room where Adrian met with August Rourke was a study off the cathedral's main hall bookshelves. Leather chairs, a fireplace that was actually burning, which struck her later as an odd detail. That someone had built a fire in a room for a conversation that wasn't supposed to last long. She wasn't there for it. She had no way of knowing what was said. But she knew Adrian well enough by now, which was to say, she had spent 14 hours in proximity to him and had paid very close attention to read the state of him when he returned to the reception 23 minutes later. His walk was the same. His posture was the same. His expression was, as always, close to unreadable, but his jaw was doing something specific. A very small thing, a barely there tension, the kind that lives just below the ear. She'd noticed it once before, in the loading bay, in the moment before Dante's accounting began. It was the tension of a man who has received information he already suspected, and is now deciding what to do with certainty instead of suspicion. She positioned herself near enough that he could reach her without crossing the room. He did, within 2 minutes. With a fresh drink for each of them that she understood he'd gotten to have something to do with his hands. Well, she said, he knows about the docks. Adrian's voice was very low. positioned precisely beneath the ambient noise of the room. Not that Dante's gone, that will take until morning to circulate. The financial irregularities, the missing accounts. He knew before tonight. Eveline processed that. He knew Dante was stealing. He knew someone was. He's been watching the Southern Port numbers for months. Adrian's glass went to his lips, but didn't quite tilt. He came tonight to see whether I knew. It was a diagnostic. And now he knows you do. Now he knows I'm aware of the problem and that the problem has been addressed. What he doesn't know is the full scope of what was stolen, or whether I can account for it. He finally drank. He gave me 72 hours to produce a complete accounting of the Southern Docks finances for the past 18 months. Or, the word hung in the warm air between them. Or he moves to assume direct oversight of the Southern Territory. Protective measure for the wider syndicate. Adrian's voice remained flat, which is a polite way of saying he takes what Dante tried to take, except legally, within the structure, and I spend the next decade as a junior partner in my own organization. Eveline thought about the man she'd seen in the corner eating his dinner with that unhurried composure, watching her with frank, unguarded attention. She thought about the specific quality of that attention. It hadn't been the attention of a man who was curious. It had been the attention of a man who was auditing. The ledgers, she said. Dante gave you an accounting tonight, a verbal accounting, under duress. Adrian's expression didn't change. It was worth nothing without the physical documentation. The real books are somewhere in Dante's operation, his offices at the Southern Port, or a secondary location. His people will have them. His people who now know Dante is gone. Yes. So by morning, those books are either destroyed or moved. Yes. She felt the weight of that settling into the room around them, heavier than the conversation warranted, heavier than anything that had happened tonight, because tonight had been a bullet and a gun and a man's ambition dealt with in a loading bay. This was different. This was the kind of threat that wore a suit and used procedural language and could not be countered with a brass lamp. Who in Dante's operation can we reach before morning? She said. Adrian looked at her. The gray eyes again. That particular quality of attention that was still, she thought, in the process of revising its initial assessment. His logistics manager, Adrian said. A man named Pryor. He's been with the Southern Docks for 8 years. And he was not loyal to Dante specifically. He was loyal to the operation, to the revenue. A pause. He might be reachable. Then reach him. It's midnight. Yes, Eveline said. It is. Something in Adrian's face shifted. Not softened, that was the wrong word for anything. Adrian Voss's face did. But there was an adjustment, something in the architecture of his expression that made space for a different kind of looking. Pulled out his phone. The call took 4 minutes. She didn't hear the other side of it, but she watched Adrian's face as he spoke, and she watched the precise moment when the conversation stopped being a negotiation and became an agreement, and she filed that moment away too, with everything else she'd been filing all night. When he hung up, he said, Pryor will meet with us at the port at 2A. Us, she said. You seem to be better at reading a room than anyone on my current payroll. He put the phone away. Is that a problem? No, she said. It's not. What happened next was an hour of sustained performance that Eveline found, in retrospect, more exhausting than the gunshot and the fight in the ladies' lounge combined. Because fear was at least clean. You knew what it was and what it demanded of you. Performance of a perfect wedding reception required something more complex, sustained warmth, sustained ease, sustained signals of normalcy radiating outward into a room full of people who were themselves performing, and the layers of it pressed down on her in a way that made her ribs ache more than Marcella's elbow had. She found her father once, near the end of it. Bernard Mercer was standing at the edge of the dessert table, with a plate of untouched cake, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him look. He was a man of medium height who had always made himself seem larger through confidence, the specific confidence of someone who believed the rules were surmountable, that the next card would be better, that the momentum would shift. He'd believed it right up until it didn't. And now he stood at his daughter's wedding reception in a borrowed pressed suit, looking at a plate of cake he couldn't eat, looking like what he was, a man who had used up everything around him and was only now beginning to understand the cost. He saw her. His face did something complicated and painful. Eveline, he said. She stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you for coming, she said. Her voice was polite and distant and completely impenetrable, and she watched her father flinch from it, the way you flinch from something cold. He stopped. His mouth worked. You look, the dress is beautiful. It should be. It was expensive. Eveline, Dad. She said it quietly. Not tonight. There is nothing you can say to me tonight that I'm ready to hear. She held his eyes for just a moment longer. Go home. Get some sleep. We'll talk when I know what there is to talk about. She walked away. She didn't shake. She felt the absence of shaking, like a strange new muscle something that hadn't been there this morning that was there now, settled in, weight-bearing. At 1:15, the wedding guests began to thin. The string quartet packed their instruments. The champagne towers were reduced to their last bottles. Eveline and Adrian stood near the entrance and received the departing guests with the gracious efficiency of a couple who had been doing this for years. And when the last one had gone, Carver materialized at Adrian's shoulder and said 3 words. Mar didn't leave. Adrian didn't move. We're a corner of the south corridor. He's been there for 40 minutes, talking on his phone. Carver's voice was a careful flat line. Got 2 men on him. He hasn't made a move. He's waiting for something, Eveline said. Both men looked at her. He was already irritated before the shot, she said. Not nervous, irritated. Like someone whose plan had complications he hadn't anticipated. She looked at Adrian. Dante was moving money from the southern docks. But the southern docks are adjacent to the eastern territory. Mar runs the eastern docks. Silence. You think Mar knew, Adrian said. I think Mar might have more than known. She was thinking it through as she said it, feeling the shape of it. Dante needed somewhere to move money without it appearing in the southern accounts. If you want to hide money from a port operation, the cleanest way is to route it through an adjacent operation that you have a secondary relationship with. Adrian was very still. If Mar was taking a percentage, she said, then Dante's accounting tonight didn't give you the whole picture. And Mar knows that. And Mar knows that. By morning, when you start pulling the real documentation, his name is going to appear in places it shouldn't be. Corridor was very quiet around them. The candles had burned low. The cathedral smelled of melted wax and cold stone and the residue of 500 people's perfume. And in that smell, in that exhausted, post-celebration stillness, Adrian Voss stood and absorbed what his wife of 7 hours had just worked out, while he was managing the immediate threat of Dante Bellaro. He's not waiting for something, Adrian said slowly. No, Eveline said, he's deciding. Carver said, deciding what? Whether to run, she said, or whether to try to get ahead of this. The 3 of them stood in the quiet cathedral entrance, and the weight of that settled around them. And then Adrian said to Carver, bring him to me, politely. Politely, Carver repeated, with the exact inflection of a man who understood what the word meant in context. For now, Adrian said, yes. Carver left. Adrian turned to Eveline, and the look on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before, not the recalibrating assessment of earlier, not the controlled flatness that was his default. This was something raw. A man who is used to knowing more than everyone in the room, encountering the specific discomfort of having missed something significant. You saw Mar's reaction during the shooting, he said. I saw what I saw. She wasn't going to dress it up. Didn't. You were managing the room. You were performing. She paused. It's harder to watch when you're performing. That's a generous reading of it. I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, without particular inflection, I owe you an adjustment. To what? To how I've been thinking about this arrangement. She absorbed that. It was not an apology. She didn't think Adrian Voss has easy access to apologies, but it was something more honest than anything he'd offered her all day. She decided to accept it for what it was. We'll address that when we're not in a cathedral at 1 in the morning, she said. It was the closest he'd come to it all night, and it was still barely visible, barely there, but she caught it. Silas Marr came down the corridor between 2 accompanying to 2 of Carver's men with the controlled walk of a man who's working very hard not to look like what he is, which is a man who has been caught in a calculation that didn't work out. He was 52, thick-chested, with the weathered face of someone who had done a decade of physical work before moving into management, and he wore his suit like armor he was slightly too big for. Stopped in front of Adrian. "Long night," Mar said. His voice was steady. "Practice steady. Sit down, Silas." "I'm fine standing." "I wasn't asking." Adrian's voice was the same flat, even note he'd used with Dante in the loading bay. Voice that Eveline was beginning to understand was his most dangerous register, precisely because it contained no affect at all. It was the vocal equivalent of a room with all the oxygen removed. Mar sat down on one of the chairs. The wedding planner had not yet cleared away. Adrian sat across from him. Eveline remained standing, slightly to Adrian's right, and she watched Mar's eyes move to her briefly, and then away, and she watched him decide to treat her as peripheral. She let him. "Tell me about the routing accounts," Adrian said. Mar's face did not change. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Then I'll be specific." Adrian crossed one leg over the other, with the ease of a man settling in for something he's prepared for. "For the past 14 months, Dante Bellaro has been moving money from the southern port operations through a secondary ledger. Cleanest pathway for that kind of movement, given the port geography, is a shared routing account with the eastern operations." He paused. "Your operations? I don't know anything about Dante's accounts." "You used the word Dante's," Eveline said. Mar looked at her. "Adrian said southern port operations," she said. "He didn't say Dante's name." Filled that in. She kept her voice conversational, observational, not accusatory, which means you already know whose accounts he's talking about. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who has just made a small, irreparable mistake. Mar's jaw tightened. He looked back at Adrian. "You're going to believe a woman you met this morning over 14 years of—" "Answer the question," Adrian said. "Not the one about whether I believe her. The one about the routing accounts." Another silence. Longer. Mar looked at the floor, at his hands, at the middle distance. He was doing the same math Dante had done, and arriving at the same result that the angles were closed, that the exit routes had been blocked, that the decision he'd been sitting in the corner making for the past 40 minutes had run out of time. It was one account, Mar said. His voice had changed. Practiced steadiness had gone out of it, left something tired and slightly smaller behind. One shared routing account. I told him it was for tax efficiency, legitimate on paper, if you didn't look too hard. He stopped. I took a flat fee, not a percentage. A flat fee twice. That's all. How much? Mar told him. Adrian's expression didn't flicker, and in exchange for that flat fee, the routing account masked the movement of what exact total. Mar told him that too. The number was larger than Eveline had expected, and she absorbed it without moving. Is there documentation? Adrian said. Nothing that has my name on it directly. Mar paused. Dante kept records of everything. He was meticulous. Pathologically, a short, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. If you find his physical files, I'm in them. I know, Adrian said. 2 words landed like something final. Mar looked at him. Really looked the performance completely stripped away now. Just a tired 52-year-old man in an ill-fitting suit who had made a calculation about risk and reward 14 months ago and was only now paying the full price for it. What happens to me? Mar said. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He looked at Eveline briefly, quickly, a glance that asked something she answered with the smallest possible tilt of her head. You're going to help Pryor pull the physical documentation from the southern port tonight, Adrian said. Everything. Every account, every ledger, every routing record, with your name anywhere near it. You're going to produce it voluntarily and completely, and you're going to be at those docks at 2 a.m. He paused. After that, we'll discuss what your role looks like going forward. It was not mercy. Eveline understood that. It was utility. Mar's cooperation had value in the next 6 hours that exceeded whatever other response might otherwise be appropriate, and Adrian was making a precise and temporary calculation. Mar understood it too. He nodded once, with the careful nod of a man accepting terms he's in no position to negotiate. Carver took him out. The cathedral was fully empty now, except for the 2 of them and the distant movement of security. Candles were nearly gone. The flowers were beginning to close. The wedding cake sat on its cart with a single missing slice, and the boarded-over window sat dark in the east wall. And Eveline's wedding dress was dirty at the hem from the loading bay concrete. and torn slightly at the left seam from the fight in the ladies' lounge. And she was so tired she could feel it behind her eyes like pressure. Adrian looked at her. "You need to change," he said, "and eat something. We have a meeting at 2 a.m., which gives us 30 minutes. He stood. He looked at the wedding cake for a moment, just a moment, then away. "There's a car outside." She nodded. They walked out of the cathedral together, through the enormous iron doors, into the cold night air. The city moved below the cathedral steps with its normal, indifferent urgency taxis, late pedestrians, the distant sound of a siren somewhere on the east side. The world continuing exactly as it had been, completely unaware. Eveline stood at the top of the steps in her ruined wedding dress and breathed the cold air and felt the night settle around her like something physical. Her ribs ached where Marcella had hit her. Her feet hurt from the heels. Her hands were steady, which still surprised her a little. Adrian stopped beside her. Not close and appropriate distance, still formal, still careful. But beside her, "Rourke is going to want more than the accounting," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the city, the way people look at things they are simultaneously responsible for and unable to fully control. "When we get to the docks tonight and we start pulling Dante's records, whatever we find there, it's not going to be clean. Dante ran that territory for 5 years. 5 years is a long time to hide things." He paused. "We may find out that the problem is larger than one man's ambition. You're telling me we might be walking into something worse than what we think we are. I'm telling you that 72 hours is not much time, and the picture may get worse before it gets better." And he stopped. She waited. "And I'm telling you," he said, more slowly, "that what you choose at 2 a.m. tonight is different from what you chose in there." He gestured at the cathedral door behind them. "In there, the situation found you. What happens at docks, you're walking toward it deliberately, with full information." He turned and looked at her. "That's a different kind of choice." The night was cold and clear, and the city moved below them. And Eveline Mercer stood at the top of the cathedral steps and understood exactly what he was saying, and understood exactly what it meant, and felt the weight of it press against the bruise on her ribs like something real. "I know," she said. She walked down the steps toward the waiting car. She did not look back. The southern port at 2 in the morning smelled like diesel fuel, salt water, and the particular cold that comes off the ocean in late November, a wet, penetrating cold that gets into clothing and doesn't leave. Eveline had changed in the car. Adrian's driver had produced, with the matter-of-fact efficiency that she was beginning to understand was standard in Adrian's world. A bag containing dark trousers, a heavy sweater, and flat boots in her approximate size. She didn't ask how they knew her size. She was past asking certain questions. The dress went into the bag. She didn't look at it again. The port was a sprawl of warehouses, loading cranes and container stacks that extended along the waterfront for nearly half a mile. At this hour, it ran on skeleton operations a few night. Crews moving containers in the far section, the distant mechanical groan of equipment, security lights throwing yellow pools across wet concrete. Dante's administrative building was a 2-story structure at the eastern end of the complex, separated from the main loading areas by a chain-link fence and a gate that Carver's team had already opened. Pryor was waiting inside. He was a lean man in his mid-40s, with the careful, precise demeanor of someone who had spent years making order out of other people's chaos. He wore a Port Authority jacket over his street clothes, and he held a thermos in both hands. And he looked, when Adrian walked through the door, like a man who had already made his peace with whatever was coming, and was simply waiting to find out what shape it would take. Mar came in behind them. Pryor looked at Mar, the way you look at someone whose presence explains a great deal. "You brought him," Pryor said. "He volunteered," Adrian said. Something passed across Pryor's face, not quite contempt, not quite resignation. He set his thermos on the nearest desk. "Then we should start." The administrative office was exactly what the outside suggested, functional, unglamorous, the kind of space where the work of moving money and product gets recorded rather than celebrated. Filing cabinets along 2 walls, a central desk covered in ledger books and manila folders, a second desk in the corner with a computer that Pryor had already powered on. a whiteboard on the near wall with shipping schedules written in blue marker. Eveline stood slightly apart, while Adrian and Pryor began the work, and she looked at the room the way she'd been looking at rooms all night. And she started reading what the room said about the man who had occupied. Dante's desk was too clean for someone who'd been stealing for 14 months. That was the first thing. The folders were stacked with a precision that looked recent. Recent as in tonight, or possibly yesterday. The ledgers on the desktop were the ones Pryor had pulled, but the spaces where they'd come from on the shelves were too neat. No dust outline, no gap in the row. Someone had recently rearranged that shelf, filling in spaces, removing the obvious negative space that missing files leave behind. She moved to the filing cabinet on the left wall. It slid open smoothly, too smoothly she was used to filing cabinets. Had worked in the records room of a gallery for 2 years, knew what a frequently used filing cabinet felt and sounded like. This one moved like something that had been recently lubricated or recently emptied and refilled. Pryor, she said. He looked up from the desk where he was walking Adrian through a column of figures. Who else has been in this building tonight? She said. Pause. Careful. The night crew cycles through for break room access. That's standard. Who specifically? Another pause. Longer. Lenny Voss handles the night security rotation for this building. Adrian went very still. Eveline kept her eyes on Pryor. Lenny Voss, she said. Cousin? Adrian said. His voice had gone to that specific flat register. Third cousin. He's been with the port operations for 3 years. He turned to look at Pryor directly. What did he take? Pryor set down the ledger he was holding. He did it carefully, with the deliberateness of a man setting down something fragile, and he looked at Adrian Voss with the expression of someone who has been holding a piece of information like a coal in their hand, waiting for the right moment to pass it off and finally reaching it. Mr. Voss, he said, there's something you need to understand about the scope of what's been happening here before we go any further. Then explain it, Adrian said. The Southern Docks have been running 2 sets of books for 14 months. You know that. What you don't know is that the second set, the real set, wasn't Dante's idea. Pryor paused. He was choosing his words with the precision of a man who knows the words matter enormously. Dante was the executor. He was the one who moved the money, who managed the routing, who handled the distribution. But the architecture of it, the way it was structured, so that it would survive casual audit, the way the routing accounts were set up to appear legitimate for 18 months before the numbers became too large to hide, that's not Dante's thinking. Another pause. Dante Bellaro was not that precise. Eveline heard Adrian breathe. Just once. And then whose thinking was it? He said. Pryor looked at him for a moment, with something that might have been pity, if pity were something that could be stripped of all its warmth and left as pure information. Your father structured this operation 2 years before he died, Pryor said. Counts, the routing, the second ledger, all of it. Dante inherited the blueprint. He didn't write it. The room was completely silent. Eveline looked at Adrian. She watched him receive that sentence. The way you watch someone take a physical impact, the way the body absorbs it, the small involuntary things that happen in the first half second before control reasserts itself. Chest, the line of his jaw, the way his hands, hanging at his sides, went briefly to fists and then released. The release was the part that told her the most. The deliberate opening of the fists. The decision to take that information and compress it into something manageable. Show me, he said. His voice was even. Pryor moved to the second desk. He opened the bottom drawer, physically opened it, not using the computer, and produced a large brown envelope that had been taped to the underside of the drawer surface. The tape was recent. The envelope was not. Inside was a set of documents that Pryor spread across the desktop, and Adrian stood over them, and Eveline moved to see. The documents were in Victor Voss's handwriting. She didn't know that yet she learned it, from the way Adrian looked at the first page, from the specific quality of stillness that came over him, particular quality that is not the absence of feeling, but feeling held under enormous deliberate pressure. Your father ran this operation as a contingency, Pryor said. He stayed back, giving Adrian room, with the instinctive reading of the moment of a man who had worked around powerful people, long enough to know when to maintain distance. The organization ever came under pressure Legal, structural, financial, there was a reserve. Hidden, self-sustaining. 18 months of port revenue diverted, compounding. He paused. The intention, as far as I understood it, was that the reserve would be your inheritance. A silent one. Something that existed outside the visible accounts, that couldn't be touched in litigation or seizure. My father died 14 months ago, Adrian says that. Yes. And Dante was given the documents. Your father trusted Dante. They had a long relationship. Before your time. Pryor folded his hands. I believe the intention was that Dante would maintain the reserve until a right moment arose to transfer it to you cleanly. Instead, Dante decided the right moment was never, Adrian said. Yes. Adrian picked up one of the documents. He looked at it. His father's handwriting, which Eveline could now see over his shoulder, not elegant, not careful, a cramped and purposeful hand, the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly and rarely reconsidered. She looked at Adrian's face, and she watched him work through something private and enormous behind the flat exterior. And she looked away, because some things deserve not to be witnessed. Mar, who had been silent in the corner since they arrived, said, "How much is in the reserve?" Nobody answered him. "Because if Rourke gets wind of a reserve account," Mar said. "Stop talking," Eveline said. He stopped. She was doing math. 14 months of Southern port revenue, diverted. The number Mar had given them earlier for the amount moved through the routing accounts. Compounding, the discrepancy between what Dante had admitted to in the loading bay and what was implied by the architecture of the thing, Pryor was now describing. "Dante understated tonight," she said. Adrian looked at her. "What he told you in the loading bay," she said. "The accounting he gave you enough to seem cooperative. He didn't give you the reserve." She looked at the documents on the desk. Because the reserve is the real leverage. If someone produces these documents to Rourke, and Rourke sees the full scope, not just 14 months of irregular accounts, but a hidden reserve funded by Victor Voss's own hand, that's not a story about one ambitious lieutenant stealing from the pot. She felt the shape of it coming together, cold and clear, the way math always felt when the numbers finally aligned. That's a story about the Voss family running a shadow operation inside the syndicate for over 2 years. That's a story that gives Rourke justification to take everything. The silence that followed was a different quality from the silences before. Heavier, more specific. Adrian set the document down. He looked at Pryor. "Who knows these documents exist?" "Dante, myself." Pryor paused. "And whoever Lenny Voss called tonight before he left the building." Carver appeared in the doorway. He'd been running external security since they arrived. Eveline had noted his absence from the room and filed it. Now he was here, and the look at his face was the specific look of someone who has received information they didn't want. "Lenny's gone," Carver said. "His car was in the lot when we arrived. It's not there now." He looked at Adrian. "And we've got a call log from the building's landline. 40 minutes before we got here, someone made a call from this office." He held up a piece of paper. "The number belongs to a relay service. Disposable." "Rourke," Adrian said. "Not a question." Carver didn't answer. He didn't need to. Eveline stood in the middle of Dante's administrative office, in borrowed dark clothes that almost fit, and she felt the full weight of the situation pressed down on the room around her. The documents on the desk, the reserve account, Victor Voss's handwriting, Lenny's disappeared car, and the disposable relay number and the 72-hour deadline from August Rourke that had been issued before any of this had been discovered and was now completely altered in meaning. Rourke hadn't given Adrian 72 hours to produce an accounting. He'd given Lenny Voss 72 hours to produce the documents. He already knew, she said. Her voice sounded different, to her own ears quieter than she expected, stripped of the controlled calm she'd been maintaining all night. Rourke already knew about the reserve. He's known for longer than tonight. The deadline wasn't a response to the shooting. It was a countdown he'd set before he arrived. She looked at Adrian. "He came to your wedding tonight because he wanted to see your face when you didn't know yet. He was reading you, watching to see if you'd inherited the information or been kept in the dark." Adrian was looking at the documents on the desk. His face was doing something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled flatness, not the gray-eyed assessment, but something that lived further down and was much less managed. Something that was happening to him, rather than something he was choosing. Finding out that your father's final act of protection has become the instrument of your destruction. Absorbing that the man you trusted with your territory for 5 years was the custodian of your inheritance who decided to steal it. Understanding that the oldest and most dangerous man in the room has been 4 steps ahead of you the entire night. All of that happening behind his face. She could see the effort it was taking to hold it there rather than let it out. Adrian, she said quietly. He didn't look up. Adrian, more direct. I need you to look at me. He looked up. His eyes were the same gray, still controlled. But underneath the control, something had been fractured. She could see the line of it. Hairline. But, there. We have time, she said. Not much, but enough. She kept her voice flat and specific, because flat and specific was what the moment needed. Not comfort, not sympathy, information and direction. Lenny gets whatever he copied to Rourke's people by morning at the latest. That means we have until first light before Rourke has enough to move against you formally within the syndicate structure. She looked at the documents. Where is the reserve held? Pryor answered. Offshore. 3 accounts. The routing keys are in those documents. Can the accounts be moved? Consolidated and rerouted? Yes. It would take how long? Pryor thought. With the right access and the right institutions. 6 hours if everything opens cleanly. Longer if there are holds. 2:15 in the morning, she said. Banking opens at 8. Rourke moves formally at 9. At the earliest he'll want to do it during business hours, within the structure, with documentation. That gives us a window. She looked at Adrian. But only if we move now, and only if you can get to the accounts before Lenny's information reaches whoever manages Rourke's financial operations. Adrian was looking at her. He was still holding himself together with the same visible effort, but something in his posture had shifted toward her. Slightly, with the unconscious, instinctive orientation of someone who is finding a fixed point in a room that's tilting. The accounts require 2 keys, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Victor set them up with a dual authorization. Both keys have to be present to initiate any transfer. Who has the second key, she said. A pause. Dante had it, Adrian said. The room went very quiet. Eveline absorbed that Dante, who was gone. Dante, who had been in the loading bay and was now where Dante was now, was not a question she needed to ask, and not an answer Adrian would give her in front of Pryor and Mar. But Dante was not reachable. Dante's access to anything was permanently concluded. His personal effects, she said. When Carver's people, she stopped, chose a different phrasing. Was anything recovered from Dante's person tonight? Carver looked at Adrian. Adrian gave a very small, precise nod. Carver produced a phone, a wallet, a key card, and a small encrypted USB drive in an evidence bag. The USB drive. Eveline looked at it. Pryor. If Dante kept the second authorization key digitally, he'd have kept it encrypted, Pryor said. He was already moving toward the computer. But Dante was paranoid about losing access. He had a system, everything encrypted, but the decryption key stored somewhere physical that only he knew. He stopped. He looked at the USB drive. Then he looked at Dante's desk, the 2 neat shelves, at the reorganized filing cabinet. Then he looked at the whiteboard, the shipping schedules in blue marker, dates and container numbers and dock assignments, the ordinary administrative clutter of a working port facility. Eveline looked at it. She read it, the way she'd been reading rooms all night, looking for the thing that didn't belong, the element that was performing normalcy while being something else. 3rd row from the bottom. A container number that didn't follow the standard format. 1 digit too many. Sequence wrong. That number, she said. Pryor looked where she was pointing. His face changed. He went to the desk and opened the center drawer. Inside, beneath a layer of pens and rubber bands, and the ordinary detritus of a working desk, he found a small laminated card with a handwritten string of characters. He held it next to the anomalous container number on the whiteboard. First 8 characters matched. He embedded the decryption key in the schedule, Pryor said. He sounded, for the first time, genuinely surprised. Split it half on the board, half on the card. You'd need both to reconstruct it. He shook his head. Paranoid doesn't cover it. Can you open the drive? Adrian said. Give me 20 minutes. Adrian looked at his watch. Then he looked at Eveline. And something moved between them, in that look not the communication of a husband and wife, not yet that, but the communication of two people who are in the same hole and have just realized that getting out requires trusting the person next to them. Mar, Adrian said. Mar straightened in his corner. You said Rourke approached you 6 months ago. He told you I was losing grip on the Eastern Territory. Adrian's voice was even and specific. What exactly did he tell you? Mar looked uncomfortable in the precise way of a man who is calculating whether telling the truth has more value than the alternative. He said there were structural weaknesses in the Eastern Corridor, that the transition after Victor died had left gaps. He paused. He said the organization needed stability and that the smart money was on leadership that had been established longer. He was telling you to position yourself, Eveline said. He was suggesting it, yes. And in exchange for Dante's routing account access, Adrian said, you were supposed to provide what, exactly? Mar was very quiet, silent. Information. The word came out small. About your security protocols, your meeting schedules, patterns. He stopped. I didn't know about the sniper. I want that on record. I knew Dante was maneuvering for the southern docks. I didn't know the method. The room processed that. You told Rourke my patterns, Adrian said. I told Dante. Dante told Mar stopped. Yes. Adrian sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, a rare thing, a gesture that belonged to private rooms, rather than performances. Then he looked back down. Tonight at the cathedral. You were waiting in the corridor because you'd called someone. The relay number on the landline that was you, not Lenny. Eveline looked at Carver. Carver's face confirmed it. Mar had made the call 40 minutes before they arrived. Not Lenny. Mar had been in the building on the night crew rotation and had made the call that Pryor had clocked as Lenny because Lenny's name was on the overnight security log and it was the simpler assumption. Then Lenny, Eveline said slowly. Lenny's car is gone. But Lenny didn't make the call, Carver said.
We've been running the wrong name for the past hour.
She looked at Mar. You called Rourke's people from Dante's landline 40 minutes before we arrived, which means you knew we were coming here. She felt the cold certainty of it settle, which means someone told you. Mar said nothing. Who told you we were coming to the port tonight? Adrian said. Silence. Long and specific and shaped like a name that Mar clearly didn't want to say. Silas. Adrian's voice dropped to its lowest, flattest register. The oxygen-removed room. The name. Mar looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at the door, which had 2 of Carver's men in front of it. He looked finally at Adrian. Pryor called me, he said, when you contacted him for the 2 a.m. meeting. Pryor called me first. The room turned. Slowly. Not physically, but the geometry of it shifted entirely. The way the logic of a situation shifts when the piece you trusted as fixed turns out to be the one that was moving. Eveline looked at Pryor. Pryor had stopped at the computer. He was very still. He had the USB drive in his hand, and the laminated card beside him, and the whiteboard's reconstructed decryption key in front of him, and he was very, very still. Pryor, Adrian said. I want you to understand, Pryor said. His voice was completely different from what it had been. The careful, precise logistics manager was gone, replaced by something older and more exhausted and entirely without performance. I've worked for this port for 8 years. For your father for 6 of those years. And your father was. He was not a good man, in the way that word is used, by people who don't have to make the choices he made, but he was consistent. He was reliable. He told you what the rules were, and he kept them. He set the USB drive down on the desk. You, I don't know. You came in after Victor died, and you moved fast, and you made changes. And you were very certain about everything. And certainty in young men who've just inherited power is the thing that ends operations like this one. So you called Rourke, Adrian said. I called Rourke 6 months ago, Pryor said. Before Mar did. Before any of this. I called him because I thought stability was worth more than loyalty to a transition I didn't trust. He looked at Adrian without flinching. I've been feeding him information about the reserve accounts since your father died. He's known the full picture since the beginning. Eveline stood in the middle of the office and felt the floor of the situation drop away completely. Not the reserve, not Dante, not Mar. Pryor. The man they'd driven to meet in the middle of the night. The man who had laid out the documents, who had walked them through the figures, who had produced the brown envelope from under the desk drawer with the timing and precision of a man who had rehearsed the reveal, who had positioned himself as the reluctant cooperator, the loyal functionary trapped between larger forces, who had been the source. The decryption key, she said. Her voice was very quiet. You found it too quickly. The container number on the board, you went directly to it. You'd seen it before. Pryor looked at her, and in that look was something that was almost admiration, if admiration could be entirely cold. Yes, he said. Which means you can access the reserve accounts without the USB drive, she said. You already have everything you need. You already have everything you need. Open those accounts in front of us and show us. It's an empty balance. And tell us Dante had already moved the funds, and send us back to Rourke with nothing. She felt the shape of it complete itself in her mind like a thing snapping shut, and Rourke would move at 9 a.m. With the documents, Lenny, no. With the documents, you already sent him, and Adrian would have nothing to show and nothing to counter with, and it would be over before it started. Pryor said nothing. The port sounds continued outside, the distant mechanical groan of equipment, the cold water against the dock pilings. 500 miles of indifferent city between them and anything that resembled help. Eveline looked at the USB drive on the desk, at the laminated card, the whiteboard with its split key, at the documents bearing Victor Voss's handwriting. The man who had managed all of it for 8 years and had just explained, with quiet precision, exactly how completely they had walked into the thing he'd prepared. Adrian stood beside her. She could feel the specific quality of his stillness, not the controlled stillness of earlier in the evening, not the professional composure. Something underneath that, something that was the last layer, before whatever came after composure broke. She picked up the USB drive. She put it in her pocket. She looked at Pryor and she said, very quietly, the thing that had just become completely clear to her, that the only way out of this required her to become, permanently and without reservation, something she had not been that morning when she woke up in her small apartment with the broken radiator and the white box on her kitchen table. She put the USB drive in her pocket, and she looked at Pryor, and she said, you're going to open those accounts right now, in front of us, and you're going to show us exactly what's in them. Pryor's expression didn't change. And if I don't, then the 72 hours Rourke gave Adrian becomes a different conversation entirely. She kept her voice level. Because right now, Rourke thinks he has everything he needs to move against this operation. But what he actually has is your account of events, filtered through 6 months of your reporting, which means there are things he doesn't know that you decided he didn't need to know. She watched Pryor's eyes. You've been managing his information the same way you manage Dante's books, selectively, because a man who controls the information controls the outcome. She took one step toward the desk. So, there are things in those accounts that Rourke hasn't seen. Things you kept back because they gave you leverage over both sides. Another step. Open them now. And we find out together what you've been holding. Pryor sat very still for 3 seconds. Then he turned to the computer. Adrian moved to stand directly behind him, and Eveline stood to the side where she could see the screen. And Carver's hand was inside his jacket in a way that wasn't ambiguous. And the port sounds continued outside. Indifferent, and Pryor's fingers moved across the keyboard with the particular careful speed of a man who is doing exactly what he's been told, while calculating the entire time whether there is still an angle he hasn't played. Screen opened. Account dashboards. 3 of them, cascading, the numbers loading in sequence. Eveline watched the balances populate. The first account, substantial. The second, larger. The third column finished loading and the total assembled itself at the bottom of the screen, and the room went completely quiet around it because the number was not what any of them had expected, and it was significantly, materially larger than anything Dante had admitted to, and anything Marr had described. Adrian leaned forward. He read the number twice. That's 18 months, he said. His voice was very quiet. That's not 14. That's 18. Victor started earlier than the documents indicate, Pryor said. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at his hands on the keyboard. The initial transfers predate the formal structure by 4 months. I backdated the documentation because it was cleaner. A pause. All there. Every cent. Including the 4 months you reported to Rourke as already transferred out. Pryor said nothing. You told Rourke the accounts had been partially liquidated, Eveline said, which means Rourke thinks the reserve is smaller than it is, which means when he moves at 9 a.m. with the documentation Lenny gave him. She stopped, felt the shape of it. He's going to be wrong about the number, and he's going to know he's wrong, and he's going to know that someone on the inside gave him false figures. He'll know it was you, Adrian said to Pryor. Pryor finally looked up. For the first time since the room had shifted, his composure showed a hairline fracture, not fear exactly, but the specific discomfort of a man who has just watched his safety net dissolve. He had been playing both sides with the confidence of someone who held the only complete picture. Eveline had just demonstrated that she could reconstruct the picture from its edges, and the safety net was gone. Write down the transfer authorizations, Adrian said. All 3 accounts, full access. If I do that, you're already past the point where your options are good, Pryor. Adrian's voice was flat and absolute. You're choosing between bad and worse. Write them down. Pryor wrote them down. His handwriting was very neat. The handwriting of a man for whom precision was a reflex, even now. He tore the sheet from the notepad and placed it on the desk without looking up. Adrian took it. He looked at Eveline. She gave the smallest possible nod. He pulled out his phone and called a number she didn't know. The conversation was short, less than 90 seconds, and when it was done, he put the phone away and looked at his watch and said to Carver, "Lock this building down. Nobody in or out. Pryor and Marr stay here." He picked up the account documents from the desk. "We need to move." They were outside in 30 seconds, back into the cold port air, and Adrian was walking fast toward the car with a purposefulness that was different from his earlier controlled stride. This was something more urgent, not panicked. Adrian Voss was constitutionally incapable of panic, but stripped of the buffer that composure provides, operating on something rawer and more immediate underneath. Eveline kept pace. Her boots hit the wet concrete in rhythm with his. "Who did you call?" she said. "A financial attorney. He's going to begin the transfer process remotely as soon as the banks open." He didn't slow down. "But there's a problem. The dual authorization." "Yes." He stopped at the car, turned to face her. Port lights threw harsh shadows across his face, and he looked exhausted, genuinely, physically exhausted, in a way that the controlled performance of the evening had concealed, the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones. The accounts require 2 authorizations to initiate any outbound transfer. Victor built that in deliberately so that no single person could move the money unilaterally. He looked at her. Dante was the second key. Dante is gone, which means legally, structurally, I cannot initiate the transfer without a second authorized signatory. Can your attorney? No. It has to be someone with an existing relationship to the account structure. Someone Victor designated. He paused. There are 3 names on the secondary authorization list. Dante, Pryor, and one other. She waited. My father designated a third backup, Adrian said, in the event that both primary signatories were unavailable. He was looking at her with the gray eyes and the fractured composure and the exhaustion and something underneath all of it that was very direct. He designated whoever held the position of primary household trustee for the Voss family estate. Eveline went very still. That position, Adrian said, transferred automatically upon marriage of the primary heir. Port sounds around them. The cold water. The lights. That's me, she said. As of 7 hours ago, he said. Yes. She stood in the cold port air in borrowed clothes with a USB drive in her pocket, and her husband's father's reserve accounts accessible to her signature, and she thought about her small apartment and the broken radiator and the white box on the kitchen table. And she thought about her father sitting in the 3rd row of the cathedral looking pale and relieved. She thought about the feel of the brass lamp in her hand and the sound it made. And she thought about the knife in her hand, the wedding cake in Adrian's hand over hers. Get in the car, she said. They drove. The city moved past the windows in its 4 a.m. version, the night shift service workers, the last taxis, the cleaning crews outside office buildings, the quiet machinery of a city that never fully stops. Eveline sat in the back seat with the transfer authorization sheet in her lap, and Pryor's account numbers in her memory, and the USB drive pressing against her hip. through the fabric of her pocket, and she thought, Rourke is moving at 9. She said yes. His formal grounds for intervention are the financial irregularities in the Southern accounts. She was talking through it, not for Adrian's benefit, but for the precision of saying it out loud and hearing whether it held together. If the accounts are transferred and consolidated before 9, he loses his primary evidence of mismanagement. He still has Victor's original documents, Adrian said. Structure itself. Even if the money moves, the existence of the reserve proves that the Voss family ran a shadow operation within the syndicate for 2 years. That's grounds for censure, regardless of the current balance, unless the reserve is presented differently. He looked at her. Victor built this as a contingency fund, she said. Reserve against organizational instability. That's how Pryor described it, his words. What if that's not a cover story? What if that's the actual filing? She turned to face him. Family Reserve, disclosed proactively to the syndicate leadership as a security measure, managed through a dual authorization structure specifically designed to prevent unilateral access. That's not a shadow operation. That's due diligence. Adrian was quiet. Rourke came to your wedding tonight, expecting to watch you not know what you were sitting on, she said. He expected to find a young boss who'd inherited a mess he didn't understand. What he's going to find at 9 a.m. Complete accounting, a transferred reserve that's been formally disclosed, and a dual authorization structure that demonstrates exactly the kind of organizational rigor that the syndicate supposedly values. She paused. It's the same money, the same structure, different framing entirely. Rourke is not going to simply accept a reframing. No, but he's going to have to work harder to reject it than he planned. She looked at the city through the window, and August Rourke did not get to where he is by wasting energy on fights he didn't need to have. Car moved through the dark streets, and Adrian looked at her for a long time and said nothing, and she let the silence sit, because silence in this instance was the sound of someone thinking, rather than the sound of someone refusing, and she knew the difference. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. She showed it to Adrian. He nodded. She answered Mrs. Voss. The voice was old and very calm and immediately recognizable, even though she'd only heard it once, at a distance, across a reception hall. I wondered when we would speak directly. August Rourke. Her pulse did something immediate and specific. She breathed through it. Mr. Rourke, I've been told you had an eventful evening at the port. A pause. I'm calling to suggest that whatever your husband is planning for 9 a.m., he may want to reconsider the approach. Why? Because I've now had the opportunity to review the documentation that was provided to me tonight, and it contains some information that significantly complicates a simple reframing exercise. Another pause. Unhurried. The pause of a man who has never once needed to rush. Your husband's father was a careful man, Mrs. Voss. Kept records of everything, including the specific understanding under which the reserve accounts were established. The old voice remained perfectly even. Those records indicate that the reserve was not a family contingency. It was established as a personal fund, Victor's personal fund, to be liquidated upon his death and distributed through a separate trust structure that bypasses the syndicate entirely. He paused again. Which means the money was never organizationally legitimate. It was always personal, and using it now, under any framing, is a disclosure of a 2-year personal asset concealment from your fellow syndicate members. Eveline's fingers tightened on the phone. Mr. Rourke, she said, would you like to meet? A silence, longer than his previous ones. When? 6 a.m., the Southern Docks. Dante Ballaro's administrative building. That's an unusual choice of location. It's appropriate, she said. You'll understand when you arrive. She ended the call before he could respond. Adrian stared at her. What are you doing? Changing the location of the fight. She put the phone down. He has documents. We have documents. Whatever Victor wrote about the intention of those accounts, there are other records in Dante's files. Records Pryor has been managing, which means records that show Pryor's hand in how those accounts were characterized over time. She met Adrian's eyes. If Pryor has been shaping the narrative of those accounts for 2 years, the documentation trail is going to show that. Rourke's evidence is based on what Pryor told him. We have Pryor's own computer. We have his own filing system. and we have 2 hours to find everything in it that contradicts the story he's been selling. Adrian understood it then. She saw it land. You're going to use Pryor's own records to impeach Pryor's account, he said. I'm going to let the documentation do it, she said. We don't have to argue with Rourke. We just have to put the right papers on the table before he puts his on it. Adrian was already on his phone, calling Carver. They were back at the port in 12 minutes. The building was still locked down. Carver's people on every entrance, Pryor and Marr exactly where they'd been left. Pryor looked up when they came back through the door, and his face went through a rapid series of calculations before settling on a controlled blankness that did not quite reach his eyes. We need your filing system, Eveline said. Everything that documents how I can characterize the reserve accounts in your reports to Rourke. I'm not going to help you. You already did, she said. 6 months of reports to Rourke are somewhere in this system. And those reports are going to show exactly how you described the accounts, which is going to be different from what Victor's original documents say, because you adjusted the narrative to maintain leverage over both sides. She pulled out the desk chair across from him and sat down. We're going to find them. You can make that take 2 hours or 20 minutes. Rourke is arriving at 6. You choose how much time we have to prepare. Pryor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Adrian. Then he looked at the door and the men in front of it, and he made the specific calculation of a man who has run out of moves. Second partition, he said. The folder marked quarterly compliance. They worked. It was not elegant work. It was the raw grinding work of sorting through 2 years of deliberately obscured financial documentation in the early morning hours, with time running backwards in their heads. Eveline read, and Adrian cross-referenced, and Carver's second-in-command, a quiet woman named Reese, who it turned out had a background in forensic accounting that nobody had mentioned, pulled the thread of Pryor's adjustments through the quarterly reports, with the focused efficiency of someone who enjoyed finding the exact place where the numbers didn't match. At 4:47 a.m., Reese said, "Here, the discrepancy was in the third quarter report. Pryor had characterized the reserve accounts as containing a balance 23% lower than the actual figure at that time. The adjustment was small enough to avoid obvious suspicion, but large enough to matter, and more importantly, it was accompanied by a notation, in Pryor's own careful handwriting in the digital margin, that read, per V. V original instruction, adjusted for discretionary allocation. He falsified Victor's instruction, Adrian said. He was looking at the screen over Reese's shoulder, and his voice had gone to somewhere very low and very cold. He created a paper trail, suggesting my father authorized the mischaracterization, so that if anyone ever audited the accounts, it looked like Victor directed the underreporting, Eveline said, which shifts the liability from Pryor to Victor, to you by inheritance. She looked at Pryor. Pryor was looking at the screen. He looked like a man watching the last door close. You weren't managing the accounts for either side, she said. You were building a case. 2 years of documentation that ultimately pointed all liability at the Voss family and left you as the independent manager who simply followed instructions. She felt the cold precision of it. If Rourke moved against Adrian, you'd testify that everything was done under Victor's direction. If Adrian had found the accounts himself and tried to use them, the adjusted documentation would have made it look like the family had been deliberately understating the reserve to avoid syndicate oversight. She paused. Either way, the organization inherits the port, and you become the trusted administrator who exposed the misconduct. The room was very quiet. You were going to own the southern docks, she said, through the organization, through Rourke, with your name nowhere near the crime. Pryor said nothing. Outside, the sky had begun to do the first gray thing that precedes dawn, not light yet, not even the suggestion of light, but a faint reduction in the depth of the dark. 5:15 a.m., 45 minutes until Rourke arrived. Eveline turned to Adrian. Print everything. The original Victor documents, the quarterly reports, the discrepancy notation, the adjusted balances. All of it. Rourke comes with his own documentation, Adrian said. I know. But his documentation comes from Pryor, which means it contains the same falsifications. When we lay them side by side, Victor's originals against Pryor's adjusted copies, the alterations will be visible. She felt completely awake in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The exhaustion was there, underneath everything, but it was below the waterline. Rourke is a man who values precision. He's going to see the alterations immediately. He's going to understand what Pryor built. And then what? Adrian said. He still has grounds to challenge the organizational legitimacy of the reserve. Yes. But grounds to challenge are different from grounds to take. She looked at him. If we walk into that meeting with everything Pryor built, and we put it on the table before Rourke does, we're not defending ourselves. We're presenting. We're showing a complete picture, including the manipulation, and we're asking the question that Rourke is going to have to answer for himself. Yeah. Who in this room actually betrayed the syndicate's interests? Adrian held her gaze. The port lights outside. The gray pre-dawn. The building with its locked doors and two compromised men and Reese at the computer, pulling the thread of 2 years of careful deception. It might not be enough, he said. I know, she said. Rourke has been in this world for 40 years. He's survived things we don't have context for. He's not going to simply accept a counter-narrative because the documents support it. No, she agreed. He's going to test it. He's going to push it, look for holes, look for the angle we're hiding. She felt the particular clarity of someone who has moved past fear into the territory, beyond it, where everything is just problem and solution, weight and counterweight. So we don't hide an angle. We give him the complete picture, including the parts that don't favor us. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Victor's reserve was not structured legitimately, she said. That's true. We don't argue that it was. We acknowledge it. We say Victor made this. It wasn't clean, and we found out tonight that the man he trusted to maintain it used it to build a case against the family he was supposed to protect. She paused. And then we put the accounts on the table, and we transfer them, publicly, into a structure that is clean, a declared organizational reserve, with dual authorization and full syndicate visibility. And we let Rourke decide whether he wants to spend his capital fighting a man who just cleaned up his own inheritance, or whether he wants to acknowledge that the real threat to the organization tonight was the one sitting in an administrative chair for 8 years. Printer ran. Pages came out in sequence, warm, carrying the specific smell of fresh toner and the weight of 2 years of careful lies. At 5:53 a.m., August Rourke's car arrived at the southern port. Eveline watched it through the window, a dark sedan, unhurried, parking, with the precision of a professional driver. 2 men got out first. Then Rourke, in a charcoal overcoat, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who has never once been required to hurry. He looked at the building. He looked at Carver's men at the entrance. He looked, briefly, toward the window where Eveline stood, though he couldn't possibly have seen through the angle in the glass. She stepped back from the window. Adrian was at the desk. The documents were laid out, their documents, organized in a sequence that told a specific story. Victor's originals, Pryor's quarterly reports, the discrepancy notation, the adjusted balances, the transfer authorizations. And at the far end of the table, separated physically from the rest, Pryor's falsified characterizations of Victor's instructions, printed and labeled. Pryor sat in the corner. Marr sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. Eveline stood beside the desk. She was still in the dark sweater and borrowed boots. Her hair had dried from the cold port air into something that was no longer a wedding style and had not yet become anything else. She hadn't slept. Her ribs ached from Marcella's elbow, and she could feel a bruise forming along her left forearm that she hadn't noticed earlier. Her hands were steady. She thought about the dress in the bag in the car, the ivory silk, the cathedral-length veil. She thought about the woman who had worn it 13 hours ago, who had stood at an altar and said words she hadn't chosen in a ceremony she hadn't designed for a future she hadn't been asked about. That woman felt very far away. Not gone, she was still there. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the port cold and the warm pages of documentation on the table, but far enough that the distance was measurable. The iron door opened. August Rourke walked into the room, and he looked at the table, and he looked at Pryor in the corner, and he looked at Adrian standing at the desk, and he looked, last and longest, at Eveline. She looked back. He was older up close than across a reception hall. The lines in his face were deep and specific, each one earned. His eyes were a pale, clear color that she hadn't expected, not the dark, hooded eyes of the powerful men in films, but Something lighter, more direct. Eyes that had been assessing situations for 4 decades and had developed a very clean, very fast mechanism for doing it. He looked at her for 3 seconds. "You called this meeting," he said. His voice was exactly as it had been on the phone. Old, calm, carrying the weight of someone who has never needed volume to be heard. "I did," she said. "Then I'll hear what you have to say." He didn't move toward the table. He stood where he was, in the doorway, in his charcoal overcoat, and waited with the absolute patience of a man who owns the time in whatever room he enters. Eveline picked up the first document from the table. "There are 2 versions of the same story on this table," she said. "I'm going to show you both of them." She picked up the first document, and she held it out toward August Rourke, and she said, "This is what Victor Voss actually wrote." Rourke didn't move from the doorway. His 2 men were behind him, still, watching the room with the flat attention of people paid to watch rooms. He looked at the document in her extended hand for a moment, then he walked forward 3 steps. Unhurried, the charcoal overcoat, shifting with the movement, and he took it. He read it. He was a fast reader. She'd expected that. He handed it back without expression. "I've seen this document." "The original," she said, "not the version in your file." That landed. Small, but it landed. She saw it in the way he became fractionally more still. The barely visible adjustment of a man whose internal machinery has just registered a discrepancy. "Show me," he said. She laid both versions on the table. Victor's original, pulled from Pryor's brown envelope. Copy from Rourke's file, which one of his men had produced from a leather portfolio when they entered. Side by side, under the administrative office's harsh fluorescent lighting, the differences were not large, they were precise. Specific words altered, a date adjusted by 11 days. One paragraph, in the middle of the second page, where Victor's original described the reserve as organizationally contingent, replaced in the copy with language that characterized it as personal and discretionary. Rourke looked at both documents for a long time. He looked at Pryor. Pryor was sitting in the corner with his hands on his knees and his face completely closed, and he did not look back at Rourke, which was itself an answer. "How long?" Rourke said. Not to Eveline, not to Adrian. Pryor directly, with the specific flatness of a very old and very dangerous man who has just discovered that someone he trusted has been feeding him shaped information for an indeterminate period of time. Pryor said nothing. "How long?" Rourke said again. Same volume. Same flatness, but something underneath it shifted a pressure change, like the atmosphere in the room had altered by several degrees. 2 years, Eveline said, from the point Victor established the reserve. Pryor has been managing what each side knew and didn't know for 2 years. He shaped your information to support a case against the Voss family. He shaped Adrian's information to prevent him from finding the reserve before Pryor could position himself as the indispensable administrator through the transition. She paused, building toward a syndicate takeover of the southern port in which his own role would appear to be institutional continuity rather than cause. Rourke stood very still. He was looking at Pryor with the pale, clear eyes that had been assessing situations for 4 decades, and whatever he was thinking behind those eyes was completely inaccessible, which struck Eveline as the most genuinely frightening thing she had encountered in the past 14 hours. Because everything else tonight had been readable. Fear was readable. Ambition was readable. Betrayal, once you knew the shape of it, was readable. August Rourke standing in a room and thinking was not readable, and that opacity was the specific opacity of someone who had made decisions from behind it for a very long time. "Counts," Rourke said. He turned from Pryor and looked at the table, at the transfer authorizations, at the balance figures Reese had printed. "Transfer them." Adrian looked at him now. Here, Rourke pulled out a chair and sat down at the table with the matter-of-fact ease of a man taking a seat in his own office. "I'll witness the transfer. Into a declared organizational structure with full syndicate visibility, as you've proposed." He looked at Eveline. "That was the proposal." "Yes," she said. "Then do it." He settled back in the chair, and while your attorney processes it, you and I are going to discuss the future of the southern port operations. Because whoever manages this territory going forward is not going to be someone who has spent 2 years lying to me. He looked at Pryor when he said it. The sentence was not loud. Didn't need to be. Pryor finally looked up. His face, when he met Rourke's eyes, did something that Eveline hadn't seen from him. All night, it showed the thing underneath the precision, the thing that had been running all that careful machinery. It was not remorse. It was something closer to the exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a very complex structure for a very long time and has just watched it come down. I managed this operation for 8 years, Pryor said. His voice was quiet and very tired. For Victor, for 6 of them. You know what Victor was. You know the decisions he made. People he stopped. I kept this port running. Through all of it. Yes, Rourke said. And then you decided that running it wasn't enough. The silence that followed. That sentence was complete. Adrian made the call to his attorney at 6:14 a.m. The transfer process began remotely, 3 accounts, consolidated, rerouted into a declared reserve structure that Rourke's own organizational framework would recognize as legitimate. The attorney walked through the authorization sequence and Eveline provided her countersignature from the secondary trustee position, her voice steady on the phone, her hand steady. When she signed the physical confirmation sheet that Reese printed, her signature looked different from how it had looked on the wedding documents the previous morning. She noticed that. She didn't know exactly what was different, the pen pressure maybe, or the angle, something in the way she held herself when she made it. Process took 41 minutes. During those 41 minutes, August Rourke sat at the table and drank the coffee that one of Carver's people produced from somewhere and did not speak, and Adrian stood at the window and looked at the port coming to life in the early morning, the day crews arriving, the equipment starting up, the ordinary machinery of commerce resuming around the extraordinary wreckage of the night. And Eveline sat across from Rourke and waited, because waiting was what the moment required, and she had learned, somewhere in the past 14 hours, how to do it without filling the silence unnecessarily. At 6:55, the attorney confirmed completion. Rourke looked at Adrian. Sit down. Adrian sat. The Southern Territory, Rourke said. He set his coffee cup down with the small, precise placement of a man who is particular about surfaces. Dante is gone. Pryor is finished. Marr is compromised to a degree that makes his continued role in the Eastern operations a liability. He folded his hands on the table. That leaves you administering 2 territories simultaneously, with the depleted seniors, staff, during a period when the other syndicate members are going to be watching you very carefully, because of everything that has come out tonight. I know, Adrian said. You're going to need to move quickly to install reliable leadership in both corridors. Rourke paused. And you're going to need to do it in a way that doesn't look like a panicked scramble, because panicked scrambles invite opportunism from people who are already watching. He looked at Adrian directly. I'm going to give you 60 days. Adrian said nothing. Waiting. 60 days to demonstrate stable management of both territories. Full financial transparency, monthly reporting to the syndicate, reviewed by my office. Rourke picked up his coffee cup again. At the end of 60 days, we'll revisit the structural question of whether a single-family operation should hold both corridors or whether the eastern and southern ports benefit from separate oversight. He paused. That question will be decided on the basis of what those 60 days look like, not on the basis of tonight. It was not generosity. Eveline understood that completely. It was the calculation of a man who had just discovered that his primary source of information about the Voss operation had been compromised for 2 years, which meant that his assessment of Adrian's capability was built on shape data, which meant the rational move was to form a new assessment based on direct observation. The 60 days was not a gift. It was an audit. Understood, Adrian said. Rourke stood. He buttoned his overcoat with the careful, habitual movements of a man who has put on and taken off this coat 10,000 times. He looked at the table, at the 2 versions of Victor's document, at the printed account statements, at the evidence of 2 years of careful manipulation laid out under fluorescent light. He looked at it the way you look at something that represents a cost you've already paid and can't recover. Your father was a complicated man, he said. He was looking at the documents, not at Adrian. He built things that lasted, and he built things that shouldn't have, and he rarely told anyone which was which. He picked up Victor's original document from the table. He folded it with the same careful precision Pryor had used when writing down account numbers, and he put it inside his coat. I'll keep this. as a record of what the original intention was. He looked at Adrian. So there's no ambiguity later about what was built and what was altered. Adrian nodded. Rourke turned to leave. He had taken 2 steps toward the door when he stopped. He turned back, and he looked at Eveline with those pale, clear eyes, and he said, without preface or explanation, "Your father's debt to this organization, which passed to Adrian through the marriage arrangement, I'm releasing it." Eveline looked at him. "Why?" "Because it was the price of bringing you into a situation without your consent," he said. "And because you've spent the past several hours demonstrating that the situation benefits from your presence in ways that the original arrangement didn't account for." He paused. "Debt is gone. What you do with that information is your business." He walked out. His 2 men followed. The iron door closed behind them with the heavy, final sound of old iron meeting old stone, and the sound echoed once in the administrative office, and then the port noise swallowed it, and the room was left with its fluorescent lights, and its spread documents, and 5 remaining people, each of whom had arrived at this morning by a very different route. Carver was the first to move. He said something quiet to Reese, and Reese began collecting the printed documents into order, and the room started to unfreeze around the practical necessities of what came next. Marr was taken out by 2 of Carver's people, not roughly, but firmly, in the way of something that has been decided, and the door closed behind him, too, with less resonance. Pryor stood up. He stood up slowly with the specific stiffness of someone who has been sitting in one position under enormous internal pressure for several hours. He straightened his port authority jacket. He looked at Adrian. "I kept this operation clean for 6 years," he said. One more time, as if saying it again might change what it meant. "I know," Adrian said. "Victor trusted me." "I know that too." Pryor looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Eveline, and the look was different, not the cold almost admiration from earlier, but something less composed, something that had lost its professional finish. He looked at her the way someone looks at the thing that unmade them, when they're trying to decide whether they respect it, or hate it, or simply acknowledge it as the fact that it is. He didn't say anything to her. He walked out. The door closed. Eveline stood in the administrative office of the Southern Port with her husband, and Reese quietly collating documents in the corner, and the morning light beginning to come through the windows, real light now. Not the gray pre-dawn suggestion of it, but actual morning, the flat, practical light of a working day, beginning, and she felt the exhaustion arrive fully for the first time. Not a wave, more like a tide coming in gradual, comprehensive, covering everything. She sat down in the nearest chair.
Laws.
It was Pryor's chair, behind the desk, where he had opened accounts and laid out his documentation and spent 8 years building the architecture of his own ambition. She sat in it and put her hands flat on the desk surface and breathed. Adrian sat in the chair across from her, the chair Rourke had occupied. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he stayed like that for a moment, just a moment, brief enough that if she hadn't been watching she would have missed it, and then he straightened and looked at her, and he looked exhausted in the specific, stripped way of someone who has stopped performing. They looked at each other across Pryor's desk in the morning light. "Your ribs," he said. "They'll be fine. You've been favoring your left side since the port." She had been. She hadn't consciously noticed that he'd noticed. Marcella had a good elbow. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said quietly, "The debt." What Rourke said. I heard him. "Your father. I know what it means for my father." She kept her voice even. "It means he's free of an obligation he created through his own choices, which is not the same thing as him having changed those choices, or understanding what they cost." She paused. "I'll deal with my father separately, in my own time." Adrian absorbed that. He didn't push it, which she noted. 50 days, she said. "Yes. You need to move on staffing immediately. Both corridors." She was thinking, even now, even through the exhaustion, because apparently that was what she did. Pryor's departure creates an administrative vacuum in the port management that will be visible to the other operators within 48 hours. If you don't fill it with someone who can demonstrate competence publicly, the vacuum becomes a story. "I know," he said. "I have people in mind for the eastern side. The southern port management is the harder problem. Pryor had direct relationships with every logistics contractor operating through this facility. His replacement needs to be someone who can absorb those relationships quickly, without disrupting the revenue timeline. What about Reese? Eveline said. Reese in the corner looked up. Forensic accounting background, Eveline said. She found the discrepancy notation in under 2 hours, in an unfamiliar filing system, under significant time pressure. She looked at Reese. Do you know port logistics? I know numbers, Reese said carefully. Port logistics is the story the numbers tell. That's the right answer, Eveline said. She looked at Adrian, interim Southern Port Administrator. 60 days. It gives Rourke's office something clean to observe from the start, and it doesn't look like a scramble because she was already here. Adrian looked at Reese for a moment. Then he looked at Eveline. When did you start making staffing decisions? About 40 seconds ago, she said. Is that a problem? The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Adrian said to Reese, We'll discuss terms this afternoon. Reese looked at Eveline with an expression that was professional and carefully contained, and beneath the containment was something that might have been the beginning of understanding what kind of woman she was looking at. Yes, sir, Reese said, and went back to collating. They left the port at 7:41. The day had fully arrived. By then the loading cranes were moving. A cargo ship was maneuvering into position at the far dock. The ordinary commerce of the city running through its channels with complete indifference to the night that had preceded it. Eveline sat in the back of the car and watched the port recede through the rear window and thought about nothing specific for approximately 4 minutes, which was the first 4 minutes of actual mental quiet she had experienced since the laser dot moved across the cathedral glass. Then she thought about her father, not with the compressed, filed-away quality she'd maintained all night, the deliberate deferral of something too large and too complicated to handle in the middle of other crises. She let herself actually think about it. Bernard Mercer, in his borrowed pressed suit, looking at a plate of cake he couldn't eat. Specific expression on his face when she walked away. The things she'd said to him, not tonight. There's nothing you can say that I'm ready to hear, which had been true then, and was still true, but was also, in the clear morning light, incomplete. She was going to have to decide what her father was to her now. Not what he had done that was fixed. Permanent, unchangeable, the fact of it as solid as the morning. But what she chose to do with the relationship that existed on the other side of it. That was still open. That was still hers to determine. She didn't determine it in the car. She let it remain open, which felt, for the first time, a choice rather than an avoidance. Adrian was on his phone for most of the drive. Calls that were short and specific names, locations, instructions, the rapid dismantling and reconstruction of the operational structure that the night had disrupted. She listened to the cadence of it without listening to the content, the way you listen to whether the rhythm and tone telling you what you needed to know about conditions, even when you couldn't parse the details. He was good at it. She had known that abstractly, in the way you know things about people before you've watched them do the thing they're good at. Watching him do it was different. The speed of his decisions, precision, the way he moved from problem to solution, without pausing in the space between them to reconsider, because the reconsidering happened ahead of time in the assessment, and by the time a decision was needed, the variables were already resolved. She thought, I can work with that. The thought arrived without fanfare, without the weight she might have expected. Simple, practical. The kind of thought that carries real commitment precisely because it isn't dressed up. Car pulled up to Adrian's building at 8:23. The doorman moved to open the door, and Eveline got out into the morning air, cooler than the night had been. The particular clean cold of a city, morning after a night of wind, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and looked up at the building, and then at the street, and then at the sky, which was a flat, pale blue, with no particular drama to it. A Wednesday morning. The city conducting its Wednesday business around her. She went inside. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors, and had the quality of a space designed by someone with very specific ideas about what power should look like at rest, dark wood, clean lines. Windows that ran floor to ceiling on the north and east walls, and gave you the city in both directions like a map you were standing inside. Eveline had seen exactly none of it the previous day, because she had not been here the previous day, because the previous day She had been in her small apartment with the broken radiator, getting ready to become something she had not chosen. She stood in the main room and looked at it. It was not a comfortable space. It was an impressive space, which was different. Everything in it was correct: the proportions, the materials, the arrangement in the specific way that spaces designed for display rather than habitation are correct. Beautiful and slightly cold. She thought that can be changed. Then she thought, that is also not today's problem. She found the bathroom and she stood in the shower with the water as hot as it would go, and she let the night come off her in the steam, the port cold, the cathedral cold, particular smell of old stone and diesel, and expensive perfume, and the adrenaline residue that had been living in her skin since the laser dot. She stood there until the water ran clear and ordinary, and she felt clean in the specific way that clean means after something that has cost you something real. She found clothes, a guest room with a closet that someone had stocked, presumably the same someone who had known her shoe size, which she was going to have to ask about at some point, and then probably decide not to be bothered by. She dressed in clean, simple clothes, and she found the kitchen, and she made coffee because the coffee equipment was expensive and obvious, and she had always been able to work an espresso machine, which was one of the genuinely useful things her abbreviated career in the art world had given her. She was standing at the kitchen window with the coffee when Adrian came in. He had changed, too. The wedding suit was gone. Dark clothes. Simple. The same stripped-back quality as everything else he did when he wasn't performing. He looked at the coffee, and then at her, and he moved to the machine and made his own without speaking, and they stood at the kitchen window together and drank their coffee and looked at the city below. The city was doing what it always did, which was everything at once, with complete indifference to the specific dramas occurring at any given altitude above it. Rourke is going to watch us very carefully, Adrian said. Not a question. Yes. 60 days is not much time to rebuild 2 port operations with a depleted staff and under syndicate observation. He paused. It's also not impossible. No, she agreed. It's not. He held his coffee cup with both hands. Outside, a delivery truck moved through the street below, and behind it a taxi, and behind that a woman walking a very small dog with the purposeful stride of someone who has somewhere to be. The ordinary architecture of a morning. My father, Adrian said. She waited. The reserve was his last act of I don't know what to call it. Provision. He was trying to provide something that couldn't be touched, something that would exist outside the visible structure, in case the visible structure came apart. He looked at the city. He chose the wrong person to trust with it, but the intention was. He stopped. I keep trying to be angry at him for the way he built it, and then I remember that it existed at all, that he thought forward. A pause. He was not a man who thought forward as a general rule. She looked at the side of his face, the exhaustion in it, particular grief of someone who has received complicated information about a person they can no longer argue with. He thought forward about you, she said, imperfectly, through the wrong intermediary. But he thought about what would happen to you after him. She paused. That's worth something, even if it's not simple. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Is that how you're thinking about your father? She considered that. Not yet, she said, but probably eventually. He looked at her, then turned from the window and looked at her directly, with the same gray eyes that had been recalibrating her all night, and were now, in the morning light, doing something different, not recalibrating, something more like arriving, as if the calculation had completed and what was left was simply the fact of her, standing in his kitchen in borrowed clothes with a coffee cup, clear-eyed and composed and fully present. The arrangement we have, he said. Yes. I want to renegotiate it. She raised an eyebrow. You want to renegotiate our marriage. I want to renegotiate the terms under which it began. He set his coffee cup down on the counter. Started as a transaction. Your family name for protection and territory access. That framing is, he paused, choosing the word with the same precision he applied to everything. That framing is no longer accurate. And I don't want to build something on a framing that isn't accurate. She looked at him. What framing would be accurate? He thought about it. It was not a rhetorical pause. She could see him actually thinking, doing the work of finding precise language for something that didn't come in precise language, which was, she was learning, his particular challenge and his particular discipline, that he needed precision, even in the territory where precision was most difficult. Partnership, he said finally. Actual partnership, which means your input on decisions not as a courtesy and not as a resource I use when it's convenient, but structurally, formally, as someone whose judgment I've now watched in operation for 14 hours and found consistently more reliable than people I've known for years. He paused, and which means, in the other direction, that I'm honest with you about the organization, the decisions, the risks. No managed information, no shaped narratives. He looked at her steadily. We've spent one night watching what managed information does. I don't want that inside our walls. She held his gaze for a long moment. A significant offer, she said. Yes. It's also not a small thing to maintain. When decisions are difficult and information is uncomfortable and the honest answer is inconvenient. She set her own cup down. You have very deeply established habits of self-sufficiency. I watched you manage an assassination attempt, a loading bay confrontation, a corrupt, trusted advisor, and a 40-year syndicate patriarch in a single night. And you did all of it by processing internally and deploying selectively. She paused. Partnership is the opposite of that. I know. Are you capable of it? Question landed the way she meant it, not as a challenge, not as skepticism, but as a real inquiry. An honest question asked of someone she intended to take seriously. Adrian was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 20 seconds. I don't know, he said. I think so. I've not had much practice. He looked at her with something that was finally, clearly, unguarded, not the controlled performance, not the gray-eyed assessment, but the actual face of a man who is being honest in a way that costs him something. But I know what the alternative looks like now. I watched my father build something careful and private and ultimately undefendable because he built it alone. He paused. I'm not interested in that inheritance. Eveline picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the city out the window, all of it, the width and the depth and the movement of it, the 8 million lives conducting themselves below the glass with their own dramas and calculations and private losses, and this morning's specific versions of hope. She thought about standing at the altar in an ivory dress she hadn't chosen. She thought about the laser dot. She thought about Marcella's elbow and the brass lamp and the feel of Dante's phone in her hand. She thought about Pryor's neat handwriting on the authorization sheet and the way Rourke had folded Victor's document into his coat. Thought about the specific quality of silence in a room where something has just been decided. She turned and looked at her husband. Then we build something different, she said. He held her gaze. Something settled in his face, not relief exactly, and not happiness, and not the performance of either of those things. Something quieter and more durable than either. The specific quality of a foundation being laid. Yes, he said. Outside, the city moved. A cargo ship made its way along the waterway toward the southern port, bearing the ordinary weight of commerce and the ordinary indifference of large things in motion. In Dante's abandoned administrative office, Reese was already at the desk, already building the first of 60 days. In a hotel room somewhere across the city, Marcella was either already gone or preparing to be, and the sniper was a name nobody had, and Mar was somewhere in the logistical machinery of consequence. And Bernard Mercer was probably sitting in his apartment right now, Eveline thought, in the quiet that follows the kind of night you couldn't have anticipated, wondering what came next. She would call him, not today, but soon. She would call him and they would have the conversation she'd told him she wasn't ready for, and it would be difficult and incomplete and wouldn't resolve everything, because some things don't resolve. They only become part of the structure you build around them. But she would call, because she was not the woman who walked into that cathedral anymore, and the woman she was now understood that unfinished business had a weight that accumulated. Carried her coffee cup to the window that faced east, where the morning was fully established now, the sky pale and flat and clear, and she stood there and looked at the city that had no idea that its balance of power had shifted overnight, felt the exhaustion and the bruised ribs and the weight of 14 hours, and underneath all of it, something that was not quite peace and not quite certainty, but was in the territory of both. The feeling of someone who knows, for the first time, where the ground is. Adrian came and stood beside her at the window. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be present. He looked out at the city that he ran and had nearly lost, and had held on to, through the night, by a sequence of decisions that would have gone differently without her, and he did not reach for his phone, and he did not perform anything, and he simply stood there and looked at what was his and breathed. She could feel him breathing beside her, the rhythm of it, in, out, even. The southern port opens in 40 minutes, he said. I know. I know, she said. 5 more minutes. He was quiet, and then he did something she didn't expect. He let the 5 minutes happen. He stood beside her at the east window, and he let the city be the city, and the morning be the morning, and the 5 minutes pass at their own pace, which was the pace of people who have come through something, together, and arrived, against the available odds, at the other side. The light came through the glass and lay across the floor between them, ordinary and unhurried, the way morning light behaves when it has no agenda. Eveline looked at the city below, and she thought about the knife in her hand, at the wedding cake, and Adrian's hand over hers, and the word he'd said together. And she understood now what the word had meant, not as a performance for a room full of guests, but as a statement of the only thing that had worked all night, the only strategy that had held, the only framing that was actually accurate. Not her in front, not him in front, beside. She stood at the window in the morning light, and she was not the frightened daughter of a ruined man, and she was not the placeholder anyone had dismissed, and she was not the woman who had been traded across a desk on a Tuesday morning, like an asset being liquidated. She was something that had no clean name yet, which was fine. Names came after. First came the thing itself, the fact of it, the weight of it, the daily maintenance of it, choosing it again, each morning, when the choosing was inconvenient, and the alternatives were easier, and the old habits of solitude pulled at both of them from their respective directions. That was what partnership actually was. Not a ceremony, not a signature. The choosing again each day. She was ready for that. She finished her coffee, and she put the cup on the windowsill, and she turned toward the door, and Adrian turned with her, and they went to do the work that the morning required.